So we can learn about location, duration, and intensity of different parts of the brain. I want you to stay skeptical, right? And we'll come back to this picture in a little while. Because what we know about science is that about 90% of what we think is proved wrong. And so I think that what we know about neuroscience, some of it will turn out to be inaccurate. Like there probably will not be a pedophile tumor, right? There's not going to be, they'll come back and say, well, that was a special case. There's going to be some things. So I want you to stay skeptical a little bit. In part, I want you to stay skeptical because there's been studies showing that if you show people fMRI pictures, they will believe almost anything that you say associated with those pictures. Right? No, it's true. There was a study where they told parents that kids who watched a certain amount of cartoons did better on math tests. Right? And so it's like, oh yeah, SpongeBob SquarePants is making my kid a calculus genius. Right? Any parent knows it's probably not true. And they showed them the study where, people, this is a made-up study, right, a fake study, but they showed them a study that said, well, we have these control groups of kids who watch just, no TV, and this is how poorly they did on math, and here's kids who watch, a steady diet of SpongeBob, and here's their math tests, and what do you think? And the parents said, I think this is crap. I think this is a lousy experiment, and I don't believe that it's valid. In the second iteration, they attached an unrelated picture of a brain with a little arrow that said the parts of the brain that light up when watching SpongeBob and how they're correlated with the parts of the brain that do math. And the parents all said, you know what? Must be true. Right? And so there's an article out there called The Seductive Allure of fMRI Photography. And it's true. The people get sucked in and they believe that if there's a brain picture next to it, it must be worth seeing. It must be true. And so I want you to stay skeptical, all right? Because we're going to find out that some of the neuroscience stuff is oversold. And I want to be very careful not to oversell. Now, on the other hand, just because you should be skeptical, you should keep an eye out for good findings because there really are some good findings. And for me, the test is it something that the neuroscientific community says, we believe this all to be valid, right? There's not a lot of dissent. Secondly, it comports with what the behavioral and clinical psychologists have found in our behaviors already. And third, it seems to resonate with popular culture as well. My own experience, the experiences of people who write about thoughts and literature, you can kind of look and say, this fMRI experiment is very similar to what was known in the 50s through the laboratory, and Shakespeare wrote about this stuff too. So, you can start to see an alignment now and then for some of the neuroscience stuff where you say, some of this clearly is true, right? And so, I want you to be skeptical. I want you to keep an open mind. Now, we're now getting to everything I said before is sort of background and introduction. Now we're going to get into the fun stuff of the day, important for negotiators. I'm going to talk about 5 concepts. And the 5 concepts are these. First, we're going to talk about the new and old brains and something called confirmation bias. We're going to talk about priming and reactive evaluation, mirror neurons and believability, reward centers and loss aversion, memory and presentism. And I hope to make as plain as I can how I think these 5 ideas that we learned from neuroscience are critical to anybody who negotiates and certainly to lawyers. So let's get into the first one, confirmation bias. All right, so you look up at a field full of stars, every star says no, but you say, well, geez, if you look at these stars, clearly the answer is yes, right? We like to get information that confirms what we want to believe. All right, so I'll tell you a little bit about confirmation bias. All right, so there was a study on the death penalty. This isn't neuroscience yet. We're going to start with the psychology. We'll move to the neuroscience. So study on the death penalty. People came into the room, and the first question was, are you in favor of the death penalty or are you opposed to the death penalty? Do you think the death penalty is a deterrent to murder or not? And some people said, yes, I think it's a deterrent. Some people said, no, I don't think it's a deterrent. I think it's a bad thing. Then they were shown 2 studies. And these were fake studies, but they looked great. Right? These were really great fake studies. One study was called a within-state study. And it said, here are 10 states. They enacted the death penalty. In 8 of those states, the murder rate went down. All right, so that was one version of this. So that looks like a pro-deterrent study, right? So you'd present that evidence and you'd say, death penalty clearly works. 8 of 10 states, murder rate went down. The second study, they said, well, here's 14 pairs of states, a total of 28 states, 14 neighboring states, pairs. And in 11 of the 14 states, the one without the death penalty has a lower murder rate. Right? So 14 states, one with, one without, 11 of 14. So that suggests that having a death penalty doesn't do anything to lower your murder rate. All right? And people were shown these 2 studies. And they were asked 2 questions. And the first question was, please rate the validity of these studies. Critique the studies. Second, have you changed your opinion with respect to the death penalty? Well, the people who were in favor of the death penalty said, okay, now see this 8 states out of 10, the murder rate's lower. They said, this is a really good study, right? The states were picked randomly. You can see that the degrees that the scientists hold. You can look at, you can look at the whole thing. This is a really great, valid study, and I think the validity is awesome. Now this other one, I think this is not a very good study. Right? This one over here, the states, the pairs that they chose, well, they chose Massachusetts and New Hampshire. I mean, they were about as different as could be, right? And so why'd they pick those 2 states? It wasn't really randomized. You can't, and so they went through and critiqued the study, very eloquent critiques, basically saying, the one that I agree with, the one that has the conclusion I like, good science. The one not so much in agreement, flawed. Have I changed my opinion? Yes, I'm more convinced than ever that I was right. All right? Now, then they switched the studies, where the 8 of 10 states showed that the murder rate didn't go down, and the 11 of 14, right, that the one with the death penalty had a lower rate. And again, you get people to switch. Right? Now, not the same group, right? Because, but you get a different group of people who are in favor of the death penalty, and they say, this 8 of 10, the states they chose were not random. This 11 of 14, this one, great. Right? So it turns out that people really, really like to receive information that tells them that they were already right. Right? So there's a cartoon. So a senior partner sending a junior partner out. It says, while doing the research, keep in mind that there are only 2 kinds of facts. Those that support my position and those that are inconclusive. Right? And so we actually do sift information. Before I get to this, I'll just tell you, has anybody ever said or heard someone say a sentence that says, you are not like most whatever? Right? You're not like most people from the South. You're not like most lawyers. You're not like most whatever. Well, usually what they mean it as some perverse kind of compliment, right? And what they're saying is, I don't like your people, but I like you. Right? And what they're, in a way, we're going to see in a moment, that gives them a little bit of mental unrest because they don't know what to do about that, right? Because they're saying, I have this theory about the world. I have a lot of theories about the world. Like I have a theory that, this right here, this is a bottle of water, and if I turn the cap, if I turn the cap counterclockwise, it will open and I will drink it and it will give me refreshment, right? So that's a theory that I have that it's important to me. right? Now, if that bottle doesn't open, or if the cap screws the other way, or if it turns out that the water's bad, I'm still hanging on to my theory that bottles open like this and they're full of water and that refreshes me. I'm going to say that water bottle is an exception, right? And so I don't like to give up my theory. So my theory about your people being bad and me not liking them, I'm hanging on to that. Because even though I've never met a person from the South and you're my first, I got this theory, right? And you don't fit my theory, and so now I face this choice of revisit my theory, which is terrible, or discount you as data. That's so much better, right? So if I say, you are not a valid data point, right? Essentially, it's sort of like I'm building my case, and when I find other cases that support my conclusion, I say, these are great cases, these are on point, and these other ones that don't support me, they're distinguishable. Right? They're less. They don't count. Right? And so we do this when we're analyzing things all the time. So somebody who says you're not like most whatever can say, well, gee, by discounting your value as data, I get the best of all possible worlds. I get to hate your people and like you. Right? And so I can read tons of cases that don't support my opinion, and I can discount them all, just like I've discounted your value, and I can still hang on to my theory that my client is right, that we're going to win, right? And so we look at data differently. All right, so we already knew about that, right? We knew about that before we were looking at the brain, but now we're going to see something about the brain that's kind of interesting. All right, so politics, oops, going the wrong direction there. Politics and disconfirmation. All right, so this gentleman here in front of all the bumper stickers is Emory professor Drew Weston, and he's a psychologist who got to do a neuroscience study. He's also a superstar political junkie. He wrote a book called The Political Brain. I would encourage any of you to go read it. So he does this experiment in 2004 in the run-up to the Kerry Bush election. And he takes Republicans and he puts them in the fMRI, and I'm now going to make you cooler than you were. The technology people who run the fMRIs call it the magnet. So if you want to be the cool kid, you could say, put them in the magnet. You don't say ran an fMRI test, right? Because that's old school. That's for outsiders. Put them in the magnet, that's the cool kid thing to say. So Drew Weston puts Republicans in the magnet, and he says, here's some information about George Bush. What a good guy he is. You know, he spent more money curing AIDS in Africa than any other president before that. He's done all this great stuff. And here's some information about John Kerry. He threw his medals away. He never passed so much legislation. So in other words, told Republicans good things about George Bush and bad things about John Kerry. Put Democrats in the magnet, told them good things about John Kerry and bad things about George Bush. And what did he see? He saw a tiny, tiny little bit of action in the very front of the frontal cortex that lasted for like a millisecond. And it was a confirmation response that basically was something that I've filed in my brain as the I knew that response. I already knew that, right? And it took almost no work for the brain to say I already knew that. Then he switched the information. And he told Democrats good things about George Bush and bad things about John Kerry. And he told Republicans good things about John Kerry and bad things about George Bush. And they saw the older parts of the brain that sort of belonged to the lizard and the puppy sort of doing fireworks for like 20 minutes, right? Long duration response in the parts of the brain more closely associated with survival than with electrical activity. Right? That's kind of interesting, right? So you have disconfirmation, and so disconfirmation seems to impact the old part of the brain. So confirmation is a new part of the brain, and it just says, yep, already knew that. No point in wasting any time on that. No need for, use the oxygen and glucose somewhere else, right? But disconfirmation now is a threat to survival. And so what we have here is we have three pictures. Obviously, we have the cornered rat, you have the cat, and then you have this philosopher, right? Jacques Lacan. And what Lacan said that I think is very salient is when you're born, you don't know anything about the external world, right? Maybe you've got some inherited knowledge, but you don't know about a bottle of water. You'll learn that later. Like this person who's your mother, you're going to learn later that it's your mother. You don't know the word for stomach and hunger. You don't know the word for mouth, but you will learn those things because what's going to happen is from the minute you're born, you're going to cry, and it's going to be because you have this feeling in this thing you'll later call your stomach. You'll later call that feeling hunger. And when you cry, this person that you'll later call your mother comes into the room, and you latch onto her breast and you drink, and not only does the hunger go away, you feel nice and sleepy and happy. Well, that's an if-then proposition. If I feel this and I do this, this thing happens and it creates this result. Right? And so from day one, we're starting to work with if-then propositions. Now, some of our if-then propositions are going to turn out not to be true, right? Because maybe that same baby cries and notices, oh, it's raining outside. I made it rain. And it's what's happening, the infant brain is developing all kinds of new connections, and then at somewhere between age 2 and 3, it starts to lose the ones that aren't true, which is why kids start to say no a lot at that age, right? They are starting to learn the concept of prioritizing truth over non-truth. And the brain is going to start to send a chemical called myelin to insulate the parts of the neural connections that turn out to be more true, right? So I don't have to really think very hard about moving the dominant index finger on my right hand, right? This is like, so dominant hand, the index finger. That electrical connection between my eye and pointing, like see and point, that one gets sort of a lot of good response, right? So that one turns out to be very true. I can make that happen. Other ones get pruned away. Well, Lacan says that's your whole life, right? I mean, basically, your whole life is a series of if-then propositions, and what we'd like to think is that it turns you, it creates some kind of personality. And so when someone comes along and tells you you don't know something, whatever it is, that you're wrong about your politician, you're wrong about something in a case, what it triggers is it triggers the animal response because it's not so much that you have attacked that fact, you have attacked the way the person understands how to navigate in the world. And the puppy and the lizard get so shaken up by being told that they're wrong that they're wondering where that ends, right? It's like, geez, if I'm voting for the wrong politician, maybe this is not water. And so I'm going to resist that because I need to use those real quick decisions about what is water and what's not water to survive. And if you have told me that I don't know how to navigate through the world, what you're telling me is my survival is threatened. All right? Now, the interesting piece for me about this is that disconfirmation produces an animal response. Now, as a mediator, this is really big and important stuff. Because I used to, 20 years ago when I was first starting out in mediation, I thought the minute somebody admits that they were wrong about something important in their case, I want a better offer, right? You're plaintiff and you're realizing that there was some contributory negligence, lower your demand. And I thought you better strike while the iron is hot, right? While they are admitting they are wrong, you want the next offer. And what I now realize is that is about the worst time you could ask somebody to reconsider their offer that there is. Because if they are in survival mode, what they are just trying to do is just get through the next 20 minutes. The parts of the brain that are not full of oxygen at that point are the parts of the brain up here that are thinking about the future. Right? One of the unique things, the puppy and the lizard may help keep us alive, but they are not thinking about next week. Right? The puppy's not planning its vacation, it's not planning its retirement, It's not thinking about the court case next week. That is uniquely us. And when our brain is flooded with the survival parts, when the puppy and the lizard are fully activated, that part that thinks about the future is not. And that's the part we want to think of, that we want turned on when we're thinking about settlement. Right? Because the basic question in settlement is, won't this settlement leave you better off in the future than continued litigation? And if you're asking somebody to imagine the future when that part of their brain is not available, don't be surprised if you get bad results. So literally, for me, the change has been when somebody admits that they were wrong about something, rather than ask them for a next offer, I give them a break and encourage them to have a snack, right? 20 minutes and a piece of fruit, right? That's going to do much better. And when they come back, I'll start asking them about assessment of the case and maybe a better offer. And so tiny little things. If you're already a or most of your cases are settling and you're saying, I'm coming to a neuroscience lecture because I'm hoping maybe 3, 4, 5% I can do better, this is one of those tiny little tips, right? Because if you ask the person at the time that they admit that they were wrong to make a different offer, they will bark at you, right? They will get themselves set in stone, and they will likely refuse to make your offer, and refuse to revisit their offer, and then you're now stuck fighting an inertia that you created. So, what I'd like to do is I'd like to find out how this stuff works in your practices. So, some things to think about. If you're thinking about disconfirmation in another person, right? So if you're a mediator and the disconfirmation occurs in a party, then time and timing matter, right? So 20 minutes. Turns out that, when we watch the fMRI tests, the Drew Weston stuff, by the end of 20 minutes, everybody returns to baseline, right? Some people are a little quicker than that, right? But your brain is still processing for a good 20 minutes. Sending the right messenger matters, right? It turns out that if you're hearing information from a source you don't trust, that triggers the same kind of disconfirmation, and creating a proper atmosphere can help. Now for you, if you're the one that's receiving the information you don't like, the best ways around confirmation bias: role play the other side. Turns out that diminishes the effect. Write down arguments next to each other, as opposed to analyzing just the things in favor of you and the things against you. And then evaluate relative, not absolute merits. Right? Rather than saying, how likely am I to win? Strangely, different parts of the brain are activated when you say, how likely am I to win? How likely are they to win? And when you look at it at the same time, it turns out that disconfirmation doesn't quite happen as strong. So, what I'd like to do is have you either in a conversation with me or with your neighbor to talk about how is it that you get somebody to admit that they're wrong? What are the effects you've seen when you get somebody to admit they're wrong? And how do you bargain around that? All right, so when we take a moment and, would you rather, is there anybody who has a thought about this already that we can share as a group? Or can I get you guys paired up with each other? All right, let's, there's a microphone somewhere. Oh, up here? All right. All right.
I simply said in most instances with lawyers, they don't even try to convince them that they're wrong.
Say more about that. They don't.
Well, I just tend to believe that, oftentimes lawyers feel like we're all reasonably educated folks who are capable of coming to reasonable conclusions, and that oftentimes they've already explored all the opportunities that are out there, and they feel like anything that I would say they would naturally take and distrust because I have an interest. And so oftentimes I just don't even try. I set the information out there, and I expect that they're going to take from it what they will, as I will, and just move from that point.
All right, so what I'm hearing, if I get you right, is that cases are settling for reasons other than convincing people that they're wrong, right? And so one of the ways around disconfirmation is to not even try, right? Well, how about convincing your own client? Does anybody, maybe you have to convince your client that something isn't as strong as that they thought it was. And so even maybe lawyer to lawyer, we avoid that. And I'm not necessarily sure, because I certainly see lawyers trying to convince each other that they're wrong. I mean, I see that. Maybe you have a better practice area than I do. But
what we often see, I think, is lawyers will tell a mediator that my client won't listen to me because they really you. Or the lawyers are a little reluctant to tell their clients what the clients don't want to hear. They would rather the clients hear from the mediator instead.
yeah, well, yeah, I think there's a lot to that, because now you have a theory about the lawyer being on your side. Did you want to? You have a theory about the lawyer being on your side, and when all of a sudden your lawyer is suggesting that you take a lower amount than initially was suggested, there's a lot of disconfirmation there. Whereas if the mediator, they really don't know, they don't have a theory about you being supportive or non-supportive, it can come from a different source. There's no, there's no pre-existing theory you're fighting against, so no disconfirmation. All right, others. How do you work with this? This is I think a very basic question about how do you persuade somebody that they're wrong? What are the effects of persuading somebody that they're wrong? And how do you incorporate that into the timing of your bargaining? Yeah.
Well, I'm legal services, so we deal a lot with pro ses and also with lawyers. And the one thing that seems to be true with everybody is we never argue, especially with another lawyer, about who's right and wrong. I don't do that. But I do argue about what the judge might think. So it's not whether you're right or wrong, or I'm right or wrong. It's whatever data I'm going to give to the judge. Well, now you have to tell your client there's a chance I might win or lose. And it's also I've been fascinated, and I know judges, it drives them crazy, but we don't settle at all until we get to court. Like when someone sees a judge and they know, okay, now I realize now it's not me and the tenant or me and the other party to the contract. It occurs to me now that there's someone else who's going to make the decision. So it's not whether I'm right or wrong. It's whether or not the judge or some other person thinks I am. So it's not as much between me and you who's right. So it's not personal even. Sometimes if I'm there to say landlord, I say, well, I agree with you and you need to get your money. I understand everything. You are right about everything. You still may not win, but you're not. But you're right about everything.
All right. Well, let me stay with you for a minute on that. I mean, because I see that a lot too. You say, look, judges and juries can be wacky, right? And so you could be right and still lose. But then with the other side, you say, okay, so I think judges are a little bit wacky, but I still think I win this one 7 times out of 10. And they say, no, I think you win 3 times out of 10, right? And so we can still have different arguments about who's right about the odds,
sure.
right? Analyzing the risk, right? You can keep it a risk question and still have an argument about that.
Well, and that's definitely true. And lawyers have to kind of, we internalize our previous encounters with that judge, so we know what it is. But I think the other thing is a lot of lawyers that I've seen, especially in smaller cases, not the huge medical malpractice cases where there's millions of dollars on the line. Most lawyers don't try convincing their clients that hard before they get to trial because they know the magic of seeing that judge. Like, all of a sudden, I told you last week that when you listen, because this has happened over and over again to me. Someone comes to my office, sits down, says, "There's nothing in this world that's going to change my mind. Like I'm sure it's the principle of the matter, and I'm going to do it no matter what." And I say, "Okay, well, we'll see when we get to trial." We show up to trial, and magically, my client, the judge's presence in the room has done what I couldn't do in a million years, which is convince them that there's something else out there. There's a lawyer in town who does all evictions, and I do all defense of evictions of legal services. We're good friends. We've had about 400 cases together. We've tried 5 of them, 6. Because when you walk in the room, you see the judge, and everyone, I think it takes it out of that right or wrong into winning. I guess it's cost benefit analysis and stuff. But
So, yeah.
Back to disconfirmation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a lawyer, legal services as well, and I've been a mediator, but I'm thinking almost more now as a parent.
Mm-hmm.
When disconfirmation occurs, I totally get, let's go out on the balcony, get a snack for 25 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
How strong, how clear of, how clear would you recommend that you be that the other side, let's say you're talking to your kid,
Yeah.
gets that they just conceded something that's pretty important? I mean, do you drive that point home, or you just leave it alone and assume they got it? Or as a lawyer, if you're talking to the plaintiff, the plaintiff's lawyer may get it. You're the mediator now, but his client may not get it. So do you say, hey, did you get what we just got to contributory negligence?
Mm-hmm.
Or you just let that sit? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. So one of the things that's happening is if somebody does, in fact, disconfirm something that they said, right, but they're not really fully aware of it, and you're at this moment where you say, well, if I highlight it, I might actually sort of turn the puppy and the lizard back on, and I'm going to have an issue. But if I don't, I wonder whether or not it really got in. That's right. Is it going to come back, is it not really a disconfirmation, but it was just sort of a momentary lapse, right? And they're sort of, especially with kids, right? They're pushing at you, and they just sort of behave reasonably for a minute, and then they're back.
Now you're a liar, so let's go get a snack. If you're talking to a child or whatever,
Right.
How hard do you make sure that at least the disconfirmation did take home?
All right, well, I'm going to speak now for a moment as a parent, and what I'll say is, in those moments where I can get my kid to admit, for example, that playing video games for 14 hours in a row is not a good way for him to have good social relationships or with us. When he'll have a moment where he'll say, yeah, I played a little bit too much today. Like when he acknowledges that there is too much video games for a second, right? At that point, I will definitely highlight that something important happened there, right? I won't hold up his old statement and say, you used to say this and now you said this, right? And so I'm not going to highlight the fact that it was a disconfirmation, right? Because that, I think, just pushes an unnecessary button. But I will say, okay, that was an important statement that you just made that makes a difference to me, and I understand that was probably very hard for you.
Would you also say that you agree?
With the
Before you get the snack?
I guess it depends. It depends on what the situation is. With my kid and the video games, yeah. With a client in mediation, I don't need to take that stand, right? And so, what I'm liking about this conversation, what I want to encourage you folks to think about is the pieces that I've chosen to talk about today should all be very familiar to you, right? I'm not talking about anything that's a brand new surprise, right? I mean, I'm picking the stuff that I think is the daily bread and butter of negotiators, to say sometimes the other side needs to just admit they're wrong. We all know that already. We all have a lot of experience with that. I'm adding a little bit of information about how the brain works while that's happening so that we can understand maybe how to just in subtle ways change our techniques, right? In very small, subtle ways. If there's anything that happens today where you say, wow, I've been lawyering badly my whole life and now, I see the light, that would be a shock to me, right? That's not the effort today. So these little things, right, these tiny little things, and picking up something from parenting, it's important. We already know quite a bit about this stuff because we too were born negotiating from the minute we were born, and we all understand the pain of disconfirmation, right? Now if we understand that there's a real neuroscientific basis to it and it relates to this new and old brain piece, I think it may create some new theories. So,
Well, this is all brand new, and I may have been bad in lawyer all of my life. What I think is my first introduction, what I think you're telling us is that disconfirmation occurs in the frontal lobe.
no, confirmation occurs in the frontal lobe. Disconfirmation occurs in the emotional centers of the brain. Yeah.
So, but it seems to me that if you're at a mediation, what gets something to lose is an understanding, which has to start at the front, I think, that you've been misinformed, or you've been misanalyzing your case. I think that's at the front of what I don't know. And what that does is sets the dog, it sets the puppy and the lizard loose. And they're going to take one of three routes, right? They're going to either freeze, they're either going to fight or freeze or flee. And the question is, if you're the one who's going to disconfirm the other side, what is the information you're going to convey to them? What's that going to achieve?
Well,
And how do you make sure that you wind up with flight instead of either freezing or worse, fighting?
well, I think if you understand, if you know in advance, right, that this is coming up, I mean, you can sort of set the scenario, right? So you can say, if you're going to spend some time working with somebody on, say, an overconfident risk analysis, right? They think their odds of winning are much greater than anybody analyzing the situation would. So you look at a witness and they want to believe a witness is going to do well, and everybody knows, everybody objective can say that witness is going to fare poorly. I think in those situations you might want to pick your time, just pick your timing carefully. So it's going to start out as an intellectual thing, right? You're going to use words and say, okay, you've analyzed this case, or you've analyzed this witness. That's not the puppy, right? But at some point, there's a communication where, as you say, the puppy and the lizard wake up and they say, now wait a minute, they're telling us we're wrong. And I know that in these intellectual conversations, and I've had them with my wife, I've had them with my kids, with my colleagues at work, with clients, it seems for a while like you're having an intellectual conversation with the frontal lobe, and then it becomes quite clear that they're reacting emotionally, right? They're just starting to pulling out arguments that they really don't have a lot of belief in. And what I want to be careful of is I want to make sure that when it's time for them to have that animal reaction, they are not in the presence of the other side. They're not going to commit to a position that's really, difficult. And so I sort of know when we're in the realm of disconfirmation, I've got to create the right atmosphere where they don't feel like fighting is the right route. And so, I mean, these are subtle ways on a case-by-case basis. Part of what I'll do with my kid, right, if I'm going to tell them, if I know that they're going to admit that they're wrong, I'll also make sure that they're very clear that I love them, right? That I'm going to create like a little bit of cognitive dissonance for them, like it's okay to admit that you're wrong and your survival is not threatened, right? And so part of what I want to do is go straight to like, well, geez, why is disconfirmation so hard in the brain? Because it's a threat to survival. What do you do when somebody's worried about surviving? You eliminate that threat by making them feel secure, right? And so some of it is just recognizing, a break is helpful, but some of it is realizing that disconfirmation is not an intellectual activity, it is an emotional activity, and once you realize it's emotional, you respond emotionally back, which is why telling my son, I love you, at a time when he's having to admit that he's wrong is a much better response and much more likely to bring him back to sort of having an intellectual conversation than saying, well, see, right? I mean, trying to talk about it like it's a fact, right? It's a fact, but it triggers a survival instinct, and that to me is the critical piece. All right, one more and then we'll move on.
Thank you. You confirmed that my real occupation is a zookeeper. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I'm so happy for that.
It's
I now understand
so much, and
This
we'll
is-
do more things in this group.
This has been big for me. I used to think, I told somebody after learning more about neuroscience, I said, I used to think that I'm like the driver of a school bus full of unruly animals, and then a neuroscientist told me, there's only one thing wrong with that analogy. You think that you're driving.
Very, very helpful. The separating the parent and the mediator position, for me, I don't, as a mediator, I don't look to say that someone is wrong or to get that, because I don't know the origin of their value, of how they perceive that word wrong. So I would consider saying, I appreciate what you're saying, and that's very helpful to me to say, okay, once they get there, give them a break, that's another tool. But how do we get them to admit that they're wrong when I don't even know if they see what they've done or are doing is wrong, is where I work to stay away from that categorization or terming, using that type of terminology.
Well, I'm with you that I don't want to use the word wrong. But in terms of admissions, one of the things that, the fact that they're in the mediation at all, what they thought was that the other side was just going to hear them make their complaint and that they were just going to get what they wanted right away and it was going to be easy and fast. And now the fact that you're here with your lawyer and we haven't resolved it yet, and this happened 2 years ago, there has to be some admission to themselves that this is a new day, that the old day and their old thoughts is just, they weren't right about.
It's just the terminology.
Yeah, but
Everyone says, oh, I'm not wrong.
yeah.
In society, I feel that we keep going toward, don't say you're wrong. Don't say you're wrong. A friend got injured just this past July 4th, and the person that shot off the firecracker ran up and said, oh, you're okay. Never admitted that they were wrong. And I don't know how, to me, it's an example of society saying, don't admit to anything. We're telling our kids, don't admit or everything that you do is okay. So for me, to get a mediation, trying to get movement, trying to get somewhere that they can, we help negotiation, saying you're wrong, I can't, it's not effective for me, but to work with the admission, as you said, would be more effective.
They do at some point, like even that kid with the firecracker at some point, whether it's that day or whether it's a year later, might look inside themselves and say, okay, that was not okay. They might have that moment with themselves. And I think clients have those moments, right? And so part of what we could say, I mean, this is, a theory, is to say, the reason that society seems to run away from disconfirmation is because we know ourselves how hard it is. And if we can get a case resolved or we can get something done without that hard step, maybe we're better off. Maybe it's easier. Right? I mean, it's an easy way out, right? But I think it's important. All right. So, going to move on to a second one. And let's see, where are we on time? We're at noon. All right. So, reactive evaluation. Moving along. All right. So, once upon a time, Reagan and Gorbachev were in Reykjavik, Iceland, and they were negotiating the terms of the START II treaty. And people in Stanford, California, were asked whether or not they should accept or reject a particular offer. And it was an actual offer that was made by Gorbachev, although it was recorded on a piece of paper. And on the top of one piece of paper, it said the Reagan plan. And the second one, it said the Gorbachev plan. And the third, it said the UN plan. Well, 90% of the people who saw it as the Reagan plan wanted to accept it. 80% of the people in the UN plan wanted to accept it. Only 44% when they thought it was Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to accept it. All right? And so we know this idea of reactive evaluation, and we know that offers from an enemy are perceived differently than offers from a friend. Well, the idea is my negotiating opponent is my enemy. If my opponent makes a proposal, it must be good for her. What's good for her is bad for me. I should reject my opponent's proposal. Confirming evidence, evidence from a trusted source, leads to rational new brain executive thinking, and disconfirming evidence or evidence from an opponent triggers emotional, old brain, instinctual protective thinking.